Hello, my name is Tony Suttle. I'm a guide and occasional lecturer at the Dublin City Gallery, the Hugh Lane. This short talk on a work in the gallery's collection by the British sculptor Elisabeth Frink is one of the gallery's long-running series of coffee conversation lectures held every Wednesday morning. So I hope, as you listen to me in this online version, that you have a cup of something warm and comforting beside you. I'm going to remove myself from the screen so we can look more clearly at the images we'll be looking at in a few moments. Having given the coffee conversation some weeks ago about the British sculptor Michael Ayrton, I'm particularly happy today to be discussing the life and work of Elisabeth Frink with you. Another example from Dublin City Gallery, the Hugh Lane collection of British sculpture from the mid-1900s. I believe that this was a strong period for sculpture in Britain, with Henry Moore to the foreground, but with many other interesting sculptors also at work. In that period of Britain's recovery from the Second World War. Let me start with my own relationship with Frink's work, which for me started in about the early 1970s. That was shortly after the student and trade union riots in Paris and elsewhere, and the protest marches in the north of Ireland. In the newspapers and on TV, I began to see the appearance, often on horseback, of state security forces in black riot gear with black visored helmets, which gave them, to my eyes, a sinister, anonymous brutality. On a visit to London, in the window of the Waddington Gallery, excuse me, I saw a limited edition print by Frink, which I felt captured my feelings about these mounted security forces. And thanks to a small cash windfall and wifely agreement, I was able to buy it, though not in the event from Waddington's. So since then, I followed Frink's career with some interest and have been able to see her public work from time to time. And in fact, having done the research for this talk, I find I not only continue to admire and enjoy her work, but I feel I've somewhat fallen in love with the artist herself, almost posthumously. Elisabeth Frink was born in Britain, in Suffolk. In her early years, the family lived near a military airfield, and I gather her first drawings as a child featured wounded birds and falling men. The Second World War started just before her 9th birthday, and she, her mother and brother were evacuated to Devon, where she attended a Church of England school. 5 years into the war, the school was taken over for the war effort, and she transferred to a Catholic convent school. As we look at her work in a few minutes, you might like to decide whether or not those childhood experiences of living near a military airfield as war approached and having an ecumenically Christian education may have impacted on her later work. Immediately after the end of the war, she studied for 3 years at the then Guildford School of Art, and then for a further 4 years at the Chelsea School of Art. At Chelsea, one of her teachers was the North of Ireland-born sculptor F.E. McWilliam. I'll move on now to a photograph from the National Portrait Gallery in London of Frink and her first husband, Michel Jamais, an architect and a son of Jamais, who ran the well-known restaurant in Dublin for many years in the mid-1900s. Frink and Michel had one son, Lynn, who became a successful artist in Britain, working largely in graphics and printmaking. Michel Jamais and Frink separated in 1963, and the following year she married John Poole, a distinguished war hero. She and Poole lived largely in the south of France for about 10 years, but then separated, and Frink married Hungarian-born Alexander Sacchi. Now, on the basis of the several short biographies I read in researching her life, her third marriage appears to have been a particularly happy one. Alexander Sacchi was a great admirer of his wife's work and shared her liking for a country life involving horses, dogs, and other animals. She was well recognized in a public manner throughout her career. She was made a full member of the Royal Academy in 1979, and in fact turned down the Academy's proposal of her for its presidency. She was given a CBE, that's Commander of the Order of the British Empire, in 1969 and became a dame in 1982. This next slide is a full-size portrait of Frink, made in her mid-20s, about the same time as the photograph of herself and her first husband, Michel. The sculpture was made by the North of Ireland-born sculptor F.E. McWilliam, one of Frink's tutors at Chelsea School of Art. Although at this time in his career, McWilliam was considered to be part of a group of surrealist artists in Britain, I feel that this representational portrait of his pupil shows what I see as a respectful depiction of a forceful, determined young woman standing firmly in a classic contrapposto pose. This is a self-portrait bust made in Frink's mid-50s, which I like for what I see as being indicative of a sense of humor and a lack of pomposity. However, I also feel that looking at it, her expression could be interpreted as being one of troubled concern, which you might like to attach to many of her depictions of her subjects, men and birds. Throughout her life, Frink was a prodigiously hard worker. This photograph of her in her studio illustrates the physicality of her work as she chips away at the hardened plaster of an emerging, larger-than-life male figure. Her work practice tended to be based on the creation of an initial wire armature or support structure, roughly the shape of the planned finished work. She would add plaster to that and then work back into the hardened plaster as if in stone carving. In that sense, Frink combined the two traditional sculptural techniques of modeling and of carving. This next one is a detail from the same photograph. Now, is it my imagination, or do we see something of the same slightly anguished and concerned look in her eye that we saw earlier in the self-portrait sculpture as she gazes up here at the male figure she is creating? Frink's career seems to have been successful from the start. She was one of a group of strong British sculptors working at this time, including, of course, Henry Moore, but also sculptors such as Reg Butler, Eduardo Paolozzi, and of course, Michael Ayrton, whose work we looked at some weeks ago. Frink was particularly interested in the work of the Swiss-born sculptor Giacometti. In addition to her sculpture, she also produced book illustrations and prints, but is best known for her bronze outdoor works. These tend to be life scale in size and with a distinctive cut, worked surface. Frink's subject matter tended to focus on animals, notably horses and birds, and on the human male. She commented at one point that she focused on the male because to me, he is a subtle combination of sensuality and strength with vulnerability. However, before looking at other examples of her work, let's look again at the main topic of today's talk, her warrior cock, made in 1957, in the earlier part of her relatively short, productive working life, and in the early days of her first marriage. Now, I have two images, each looking in a different direction, in slightly different lighting. That's about 1 meter or a yard high, with the rough working of the outer surface giving it what I would describe as a somewhat ruffled or even scrawny look. Like much of Frink's work of animals and of male figures, I feel there is a certain ambiguity in her presentation, a mix of bravado, of male courage or machismo, and of vulnerability and uncertainty. Let's consider this balance between victor, vulnerable, and victim. Throughout her career, Frink focused on the male figure, whether animal, human, or mythical, both as aggressor and as victim, but usually with a certain ambiguity, with often apparent sympathy for the aggressor as well as for the victim. So with that in mind, let us look briefly at some other artists and their treatment of the figure of the male rooster, or fighting or warrior cock. This is from the Louvre collection in Paris and is a small bronze figurine from the Roman period of the 2nd century AD, found in France near Lyon. I suggest that it is unashamedly macho in its strong stance, the open beak, and a raised cock's comb on its head. This next one is a painting by the North of Ireland painter Basil Blackshaw. As with Elisabeth Frink, Blackshaw was a lover of the countryside and its ways. He was also an avid follower of cockfighting, which I gather, although illegal, is still extant, notably in the border areas of Northern Ireland. You can see that this work is that of an aficionado. The cock is painted in a fiery red, strong and courageous, ready for anything. Is it victim or a victor? This next work was painted by Picasso to celebrate the liberation of Paris at the end of World War II. Perhaps not unsurprisingly from Picasso, somewhat decorative in style, it shows a triumphant rooster beside a small hen. Although not necessarily or specifically a fighting cock, Picasso may be suggesting that it is by the blade-like shaping of the foliage in the top left corner of the painting. The next one, let's return to Elisabeth Frink and her world of man and animal and her sculptures. This work was made relatively earlier in her career, not too long after the end of the war, when for a time Frink used birds as the subject of her work. It has been suggested that she used them as a means of expressing extreme emotion and possibly as a symbol of military aggression and air power. This next work, Bird, made in 1952, is from the Tate collection. Frink began to show her work in public in 1951. Among her first sculptures was this strong and alert bird, rather like a crow or a raven. As I said, it's now in the Tate collection and is titled simply Bird. It was made in 1952, 5 years before the one in this gallery's collection that we are looking at today. The bird theme was to occupy Frink over the next 2 decades. Of these early sculptures, she herself said that they were really expressionist in feeling, in their emphasis on beak, claws, and wings. And they were really vehicles for strong feelings of panic, tension, aggression, and predatoriness. They were not, however, symbolic of anything else. They were certainly not surrogates for human beings or states of being. This next work, Dead Hen, is also from the Tate collection. And it was made in 1957, the same year as our warrior cock. I feel it is quite different in approach than the previous piece, Bird. However, I suggest that all 3 pieces have one thing in common. While they may suggest or induce feelings of sympathy or even distress in the viewer, each piece is itself. And equally important, each piece, each subject is itself. Each is above all an animal, a creature unto itself, in its own life, with its own pride or pathos. Now that said, I could not avoid when I saw this image in the Tate collection, but to be reminded of the Women of Belfast sculptures by Effie McWilliam, Frink's tutor, which were made in the early 1970s and one of which we have in the Hugh Lane. It may be totally a visual coincidence on my part, but McWilliam may possibly have seen this work by Frink, made a year after he made his portrait sculpture of her in 1956, which we saw earlier. This next work, Fighting Cocks, was made much later by Frink, about 6 years before her death. It was a commission from a property development firm in Britain. They had completed an office block project and wanted a piece to note that the site had once been used for cockfighting. I find it somewhat different in appearance than her earlier treatments of the subject, possibly because of the brief. It has more of a narrative element than her more familiar single figure compositions. Also, I suggest that her treatment of the surface of the work is somewhat less rugged than in her earlier birds. This next image is a Frink, a limited edition print, the one which first triggered my interest in her work. And rather than taking a poor photograph of my copy, I've taken this image from the Tate collection, who also hold a copy of the print. and it was one of a series of horse and rider prints that she made in the early 1970s. As I'm suggesting, Frink had a strong feeling for the suffering that seems so persistent in the modern world. But she was not an emotional softy. She was wholly unsentimental as an artist, and her manner and way of addressing the world was laconic, impulsive, and full of humor, but also very decisive and rigorously practical. Privately, she was an extremely generous person to good causes. As I mentioned earlier, for me, there is an ambiguity in this work between an initial reaction of fear and threat from this anonymous male figure on horseback, who is possibly about to advance towards a protesting crowd of civilians. Then, on the other hand, what is going on in that figure's own mind? Is he, and in the 1970s would probably always have been a he, is he as terrified as anyone in the crowd? Despite his protective gear, his horse, his position of authority, is he afraid of being overwhelmed by the numbers, of being set alight by a petrol bomb or hit by a sniper? He too is probably a father, a son, a husband, and even as an adult, is he still a frightened little boy? Now the next image, my previous image, as I said, horse and rider, combines two of Frink's most common motifs, the horse and the human male. I'm using this image from the Tate collection, featuring just a horse, to help illustrate Frink's capability as a good draftsperson, which she, as with many sculptors, certainly was. Now this next image, which I have taken from the Yorkshire Sculpture Park, from which we've seen work before, is titled Judas. I feel that, as Caravaggio does in his Taking of Christ at our National Gallery, here Frink has captured the ambiguous nature of Judas. The figure stands slightly larger than life, but at our own ground level. Although a strong-looking male, he stands on thin, spindly legs, his arms in a sort of semi-defensive position. His facial figure's ambiguous. His facial figure's indistinct. We go on to the next slide, where Elisabeth Frink, throughout her career, made a series of sculptures of large male heads. They reflected her preoccupation with man as aggressor and as victim. This work, Soldier's Head 2, made in 1965 and in the Ingram collection in London, is one of the earlier versions. As with the print of Horse and Rider and the figure of Judas, to my eyes, this work too has a sort of ambiguity. Yes, he looks brutal and potentially cruel. However, I also see a level of sadness and vulnerability in his overall expression, in the eyes and in the twist of the mouth. I feel he too is a battered person. This next head from the Tate collection, made slightly earlier in 1959, is perhaps slightly less ambiguous. It is one of a series of male busts in which the eyes are concealed by sinister polished goggles. The obscured identity of the person behind the goggles creates a sense of menace and aggression, and again presenting an archetype of man rather than an image of an individual. Frink considered these busts, which we refer to as her goggle heads, to be her first explicit comment on the world's inhumanity, and said later that they became a symbol of evil for me. However, this next head, which you referred to as Tribute Head, is in a different tone. And this work, Tribute Head 2, a copy of it, is in Dublin's Merrion Square. Unveiled in 1983, it is dedicated to Amnesty International in recognition of Nelson Mandela's imprisonment and organized by Artists for Amnesty, of which Frink was a long-term supporter. As you can see, it's quite different in approach to her earlier, more threatening heads. In the mid-1970s, Frink had made a monumental group of 4 male heads with closed eyes and clearly modeled, serene features. named the tribute heads, they referred to people who had died for their beliefs. Frink commented, in a sense, these sculptures are a tribute to Amnesty International. The heads represent the inhumanity of man. They are the heads of victims. This next work, Horse and Rider, is a good example of Frink's larger public work. Made at about the same time as the tribute heads in the mid-1970s. It stands on Dover Street in London, a short distance from Piccadilly Circus and from the Waddington Gallery, where I first saw my print on a similar theme. As you can see, it combines two of Frink's main topics, the horse and the male figure. Here I feel there is less ambiguity than in some of her earlier work. The figures are at ground level and restful. They do not present a threat. The naked male figure has his free arm hanging loosely. The horse's ears are pricked up, alert but not alarmed. The finish on the bronze is smoother than on her earlier work, such as our warrior cock. This next image is the welcoming Christ. Now, throughout her career, Frink worked hard. She maintained a steady output of work and exhibition participation. She taught and involved herself in a variety of bodies, including the Royal Academy. In 1991, she underwent surgery for cancer of the esophagus. She maintained her work level until early 1993, including her last major work, this large figure of the welcoming Christ, to be installed over the west door of Liverpool's Anglican Cathedral. Frink died just before it was installed at the cathedral, and she was also predeceased by her third husband, Alexander, by just a few months. This is a close-up of the welcoming Christ. I suggest that it is very much in line with Frink's approach to the male figure. I feel it shows a balance between the strength and confidence of the divine and the vulnerability of the human. I should also add, perhaps as a footnote, that reflecting perhaps her ecumenical childhood, she also produced a smaller work, a crucifix for the Catholic Cathedral in Liverpool. So I will conclude on a more trivial note and on a smaller scale. As an indicator of the public recognition she had achieved by the end of her career, this is a commemorative stamp issued by the British Postal Service 3 years after her death. It shows a photographic portrait of Frink herself before one of her works, and is for the odd sum of 31 British pennies, with Her Majesty in silhouette profile. So let us end, and with a final look at where we started, with our own warrior cock, looking perhaps slightly bedraggled, but standing, his feathers perhaps ruffled, but looking outward at what perhaps comes next, with which he will deal as best he can, in short, much like the rest of us. And as for Elisabeth Frink, who created our warrior cock, I will quote an extract from her obituary in the London Times in 1993, which noted, "The three essential themes in her work are the nature of man, the hoarseness of horses, and the divine in human form." So thank you all very much. Thank you again for watching. Bye-bye.